Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another lecture, and for today's lecture we are going to discuss the end phase of the turbulent 1850s. We're going to discuss the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But before we begin our lecture proper for today, I just want to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the I guess what would be the case of the century, the last major freedom suit in the United States. That is the case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott, of course, was a slave from Missouri who filed a freedom suit after the death of his master, John Emerson. Emerson had been employed as a Union Army surgeon and had been posted to the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. Dred Scott accompanied his master, and under the old doctrine of once free, always free, once a slave made it to free territory or a free state where slavery was not a recognized social condition, that person, that slave was freed, and he was freed forever. Slavery could not be reattached once one had been freed. Scott sued and initially was successful at the local court level, but it lost when his former master's widow and heir, Eliza Sanford Emerson, challenged the case and won her appeal with the Missouri Supreme Court in 1852, and in 1853, Scott filed an appeal at the federal level, and he would lose that appeal. He would file again at the Supreme Court level, at the federal Supreme Court level, which he also lost. The Scott case was extremely emotional. It carried a lot of political currency with it. Galvanized a larger segment of the free state and the free territory white population to opposing slavery and opposing the Democrats. It sort of gave the Republican Party a broader base to appeal to, and they did so by coming up with a very broad, a very national, and a very unslave state sympathetic platform for the future of the nation. It sort of led to the development of what's known as the East-West Alliance, an alliance that actively sought to limit the national the national clout of the slave states, and from there we pick up with our lecture. We begin with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Lincoln had entered the national consciousness in 1858 when he ran against Stephen Douglas for the Illinois senatorial seat, congressional senatorial seat, and Lincoln was a proponent of the East-West Alliance, this overhaul in the availability of land to Western settlers, the prohibition of slavery in those Western lands, the impetus for supporting internal improvements, roads, canals, bridges, a transcontinental rail line. What else was a part of the East-West Alliance? Protective tariffs was a major part of it, and the establishment of schools, of agricultural and mechanical colleges, to see to it that mechanical workers and farmers were properly educated and could meet the needs of the burgeoning republic. Lincoln was a supporter of this, and of course, its proponents said that by adopting this strategy, the United States would, make leaps and bounds in terms of their global positioning and global power to become one of the economic powerhouses of the world. So now Lincoln is on the scene. He's entered the national consciousness, and he's running against Stephen Douglas, who was a very powerful politician in his own right, an extremely popular Democratic politician, very powerful in the Senate. The two were an odd sight, let me just say that. Lincoln was tall and gangly. Douglas was very short and pear-shaped. And Douglas was in a major quandary. Had that stated, he was a very powerful Democratic politician. He was perhaps the most popular Democrat in the nation. But he had made major waves within his party and among his support base, particularly his Illinois support base. He had publicly come out and chastised the Lee-Compton Constitution, that pro-slavery constitution in Congress. He could not support the Dred Scott decision in Illinois. He came out and he chastised the Dred Scott decision as being a bad decision. But he could not disavow the Dred Scott ruling either. That would just be bad business for him in terms of being able to bring Southern senators in line, pro-slavery senators in line. It would be impossible for him to do that if he came out and disavowed the Dred Scott ruling completely. Now, Lincoln and Douglas met in a series of debates that received widespread coverage across the Republic. During the debates, Douglas argued for taking a Lincoln argued for taking a moral stand against slavery to prevent slavery from spreading into the territories and to place slavery on a path towards eventual extinction. Now, Douglas refused to endorse that platform. He refused to condemn slavery. It is said that Stephen Douglas personally disliked the institution of slavery. But Douglas insisted on popular sovereignty being the guiding principle on the spread or containment of slavery in the Union. Douglas took the offensive against Lincoln. He charged that Lincoln was an abolitionist and that Lincoln threatened the very foundations of the Republic. He argued that the Republic could remain free, half free and half slave, because that had been the original intent of the founders. And more outrageously, Douglas charged that Lincoln wanted equality between the races, a very incendiary statement because Illinois was intensely racist in the 19th century. Now, the statement was, that statement was designed to hurt Lincoln, who denied being an abolitionist. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist on record. And Lincoln denied being in favor of racial mixing, racial amalgamation, miscegenation. Lincoln denied all of that. And Lincoln promised to leave slavery alone where it already existed. But he continued to echo that Congress should have the power to regulate the territories. And Douglas won. Douglas won their race, their senatorial race, but he won it by a very slim margin. The debates drove in the debates, because they were picked up nationally, that they were seen as a forebearer of the hurdle that the Democrats would face in 1860. It drove home to pro-slavery extremists just how far from a common understanding they were with the free state moderates. The slave states extremists really sort of began to pick up steam, and the fire eaters, as these extremists were called, the fire eaters began to take a larger and larger profile in the slave states. And that brings us to John Brown's raid. Now, John Brown was one of the boldest Jayhawkers in Kansas. He participated in a number of truly sanguine engagements, most notably the Pottawatomie Massacre, where a number of pro-slavery men were put to death in retaliation for their part in an assault on an anti-slavery settlement. John Brown became a hero to both black and white abolitionists across the Republic. To the pro-slavery faction in the Republic, he was evil incarnate. John Brown believed in immediate, total, and absolute emancipation. He believed that abolition should happen, that the freedom to the slave should happen now, not later. There should be no plan for it. The only plan was, are they freed? When are they freed? Now. That was John Brown's attitude towards that. He did not favor ending it in the territories or in the slave states slowly, tackling it where it existed. He wanted it all done once, and he had a very bloody Armageddon-like image of what it took to end slavery, and he was very okay with that. He put that into practice. By 1859, Brown had relocated from the Kansas Territory and was living in Virginia, where he was plotting an uprising against slavery. He had dreams of arming slaves and leading slave armies in a massive rebellion across the slave states, thus his end game was the violent liberation of the Republic's slave population. The slave population circa 1859, 1860 was at around 5 million, give or take a couple 100,000, around 5 million in bondage, in slavery. On October 17th, John Brown and his followers launched an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is really now Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, but back then it was a part of good old Virginia. They exchanged fire with the locals, and one local black man was killed. There was not a great rallying to John Brown. The great rallying that he had envisioned didn't happen, and the reason for that was the area that he had chose to launch to make his attack from. The area around Harper's Ferry was rocky, hilly, and pretty much unsuited for heavy cash crop cultivation, and therefore devoid of a sizable black population. The black population that he had hoped would bolster his numbers. Now, Brown and his followers were driven into a firehouse to take refuge, and the Virginia State Militia, local slave patrol units, and federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived and subdued Brown and his little band of followers. Two of his sons had accompanied him, and two of them had died. Now, John Brown survived the engagement. He survived the assault on the firehouse. He survived the shootout with all those forces. He survived, but he was badly wounded. Now, the adventure had mixed results. The raid failed. Brown was quickly tried and sentenced to be hung by a pro-slavery Virginia jury, who were shocked and outraged that he would even dare to consider doing this, attempted to raid a federal arsenal to arm slaves to fight for their freedom. They were extremely shocked and deeply upset with that. He was quickly sentenced to death. As for propaganda, the raid was extremely successful. It did all that John Brown could ever wanted to do. It raised the national temperature. It made slavery and the condition of slaves pertinent to everybody. There was nobody who was indifferent on the issue after that. Everybody had an opinion on slavery. Nobody could say, "Well, I don't really care." It was everywhere. Everyone had an opinion after this, and no one will be allowed to say that they didn't have an opinion after this. John Brown, during his trial, his entire demeanor during his trial and execution made him a free state hero, which mortified the slave states. This was this was the biggest fear of the slave master. The biggest fear was that whites from the free states and free territories, white Americans, would team up with the African American slaves, those black slaves, and aid in rebellions to overthrow slavery. Now, it was understood and accepted that slaves would be unsatisfied with their position as slaves, that slaves would from time to time grow discontent, that slaves would always be in a state of discontent, and that discontention would give rise to uprisings to throw off the shackles of slavery. That was well understood. That's why they had slave patrols. But the fact that a white man or a group of white men from free states or free territories will come into a slave state with the express purpose of igniting a slave rebellion was just unfathomable. This led to a complete breakdown in any tolerance or proposals for eventual emancipation or any other deviation from the standard democratic bloc of slavery now, slavery forever, slavery always protected in the slave states. There would be no deviation on the issue of slavery from that. In the aftermath of the raid on Harper's Ferry, a Southerner named Hinton Rowan Helper wrote a book called The Impending Crisis of the South. And in that book, Helper issued a call to action to non-slave owning whites in the slave states to rise up and overthrow the slavocrats, because slavery concentrated a disproportionate amount of wealth in the hands of a few and kept the region economically backward. Again, to the slavocrats, to the elites in the slave states, this was absolutely frightening. This was equally frightening to the slavocrats. This book was the white Southerner equivalent to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was just as damaging. It was just as damnable. It was just intolerable. Now, the Republican Party endorsed Helper's book, leading the major slavocrats to come to the conclusion that a Republican president would encourage slave uprisings. No slave owning whites, no slave owning white would be safe in the South. The slaves would be encouraged to uprise. Non-slave owning whites would be encouraged to rebel, and there would be a greater push to abolish the practice of slaveholding. The Republicans had done pretty good in the 1858 elections, the midterm elections, and they will be challenging the Democrats again in 1860, and they were building up momentum. They were building up steam. Now, the events we have covered, while not divisive, while not totally disruptive, and while not bringing a divisive end to the Union, didn't really bring the nation to the brink of war. They were divisive, they were disruptive, but the nation was not brought to the brink of war. After John Brown, nobody thought that, well, now we have to go and fight each other for a couple of years to see who's going to hold sway. That didn't happen. Nobody knew that succession lay on the horizon. And it must be said that the past 10 years, that what it did was it created an atmosphere of mistrust and helped set the stage for disunion. That it did. But it did not push the nation all the way to the brink of disunion. And with that, we'll break off here, and that will conclude our 4-part lectures on the turbulent 1850s. And when we come back, we'll look at the election of 1860. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.